a big thank you to Biohabitats for bringing this idea to SER. We're really thrilled to be partnering with Biohabitats on this wonderful session, and thanks to all of you for coming today from all over the world. We've seen a lot of countries represented in the chat, so it's great to see everybody here. So as Amy kind of implied, this session is really aimed at looking a little bit at where we've been and also where we're going, and putting that in the context of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And we've really asked the panelists to engage with each other, as well as to respond to questions that you'll be submitting through the question and answer button on your screen. So please don't be shy about asking questions, and please submit those throughout, because this is going to be a dynamic discussion, so there won't just be one question period at the end. I also want, before we start this session, to acknowledge the terrible situation that people in Ukraine are dealing with right now with the invasion of Ukraine, and to acknowledge also that violence and conflict and these types of activities that exist and are happening not just in Ukraine, but this is a particularly bad situation, a horrible situation, don't just take a human toll, they also take an environmental toll, and they really help illustrate the relationship between environment and people, and the importance of having a healthy and functioning environment for people to have a healthy community within which to live. And so in the context of both the invasion of Ukraine, the horrific situation there, and also the release of the IPCC report yesterday or this week on the conditions with climate change, and that we really are so close to the tipping point. I think both of these speak to, well, I can't say that the invasion of Ukraine speaks to the importance of restoration, but both of them speak to the importance of environment, and that we as humans need a healthy planet to live on. And that's one of the most important reasons that the Society for Ecological Restoration exists, and why this whole field of ecological restoration exists, that, you know, we're trying to have that relationship between people and nature, and to give back to the planet that gives a home to us. So with that, I'm going to call on each of the panelists one at a time, and I will be asking them to share first a brief introduction. So I'm not going to do introductions. They're each going to do their own introduction, and they're going to introduce themselves, where they live and work, and just one sentence about what you do. And we've also asked the panelists, if they are so inclined, if they would like to share the name or the types of traits of a restorationist who has been influential to them, or who they really respect, or who has helped move the field forward, and what are the traits and the aspects of their work that have done that. So we're just asking for 1 minute on each of those, and if you don't want to answer the second question, that's up to you. But the first one, please do make sure you introduce yourself. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to go around my screen, and I'm going to start with Tein McDonald.
Thank you so much, Bethany. Yes, my name is Tein McDonald, and I've worked for over 4 decades in restoration in Australia, mainly facilitating natural regeneration. But as well as on-ground practice, I'm currently putting energy into convening Australia's Restoration Decade Alliance. And this is a consortium of 16 peak Australian restoration organisations working to support and promote the goals of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration in Australia. And yeah, that's pretty interesting, I can tell you. Now, I guess a person I hugely admire in restoration is Tony Renato. Tony is the initiator of farmer-managed natural regeneration, who helped African subsistence farmers turn around degradation and recover thousands of hectares of their lands for the benefit of nature and people. And I think you'd all be really interested in looking up his work on the net. He did this simply by showing them how they could facilitate natural regeneration. And he currently works for World Vision in Africa and Australia. But look, I'd like to say that we need to be admiring of all people who are working to address the restoration challenge, however small their contribution. Look, we do have many thousands of volunteer land care and bush care groups here in Australia, and other countries would have a similar movement going on, but we need many, many thousands more. So look, we need small actions from millions of people to address the environmental crisis globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tein. I'm going to move on to Keith Bowers.
Thanks, Bethany. I'm Keith Bowers. I reside in Charleston, South Carolina, the Low Country, and I work throughout North America on a variety of ecosystems and a variety of scales. I'm the founding and active principal of Biohabitats, which is an applied ecology firm that focuses on ecological restoration, conservation planning, climate change adaptation, and environmental justice issues. And we've been practicing ecological restoration, planning, design, and construction for the past 35 plus years. I think the person that comes to mind that was really, I think, the one that put me on this path to ecological restoration and is a mentor of mine is Dr. Edgar Garvish. Dr. Garvish abandoned his career in teaching chemistry and moved to the Eastern Shore of Maryland and founded the nonprofit firm of Environmental Concern. And he dedicated his life's work to figuring out how to restore salt marshes throughout the Chesapeake Bay. And that was back in the 1970s when no one could even imagine such a thing. And his pioneering research and work led to breakthroughs in wetland restoration, plant propagation, and management initiatives that are still being used today.
Thank you so much, Keith. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Packard.
I started in 1977 as a volunteer, and before too long had organized something called the Volunteer Stewardship Network in Illinois, which soon had more than 100 sites with volunteer restoration groups working with whoever owned them. I subsequently worked as a professional with the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, and whoever else would have me until fairly recently. One of the things I'm proudest of is working with Bill Jordan and Don Falk and others to help organize Society for Ecological Restoration. I thought I should mention two people who I thought would be educational for people to get to know. One of them is Bernie Buchholz, a volunteer steward at Murcia Grasslands, where in the middle of a 20-year career in finance, he showed up one day to be a volunteer, and they said, "You seem bright, you seem like you could be a hard worker. We could give you 50 acres to be yours to restore out of their now 4,000 acres, which was built in part on the enthusiasm of volunteers." And he's been there ever since. But he didn't do just that. He was a leading founder of the Friends of Murcia Grasslands, which raised $210,000 for research grants for the sites and $2 million for stewardship endowments. He was a leading founder of something called the Middle Rock Conservation Partners that helps other landowners in that watershed by doing burns. They bought a $200,000 piece of equipment to mow brush and basically multiplying other stewardship efforts. The other one is Erico Kojima, another volunteer who, when she started out, very quickly decided this is what she believed in, this is what she wanted to do. And in her 50s at the time, went to her daughter and her husband and said, "This is what I want to do. I don't want to work anymore. I want to do this full time. Would you support that?" And they discussed it and decided they would. And she has worked, when she says full time, it's often from dawn to dusk. It's pretty close to 365 days a year if it isn't, because this is what she wants to do. And she not only does the physical restoration, she recruits and trains hundreds of other people on many other sites and empowers them, community builder. And at Langham Island, Somme Woods, Old Plank Road Prairies, Kishwaukee Fen, Shaw Woods and Prairie, many Illinois nature preserves. She's had a powerful impact, as have so many, but those are two examples.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Those are great examples. Since you mentioned Bill Jordan, I'm going to move on to Bill.
Well, it's great to be here. Just a few comments by way of introduction. My connection with this whole matter goes back to my taking a job at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum in 1977. The Arboretum, as some of you may know, was the site of some pioneering attempts at ecological restoration back in the 1930s and 40s. My job there was basically public outreach. So I was asking myself what story we had to tell better than other similar organizations. And the answer to that, as soon as you asked it, was fairly obvious. It was that restoration story, which at the time, some of you will be aware of this, was really not on the agenda. And even at the Arboretum was kind of apologetic about their collection of restored communities. Well, we wish they were real. You'd hear people say things like that. They're second rate, they're fake, they're human constructs and so forth. But I felt, had kind of a different perspective on it. I think partly because my father was a forester. And although that's not exactly restoration, I grew up with the idea that a person could do good work in the woods, so to speak. And also some close family friends, Florence and John Retzer, whom my father met in the course of his work for the Wisconsin Conservation Department, and who had undertaken a sort of long-term retirement project on 90 acres of land near Waukesha, Wisconsin, in which they were doing not exactly restoration. This would have been back in the 40s, and that idea really wasn't available at the time, but restorative management. And my father met them when they called him in to advise them on tree planting and things like that. And they became close family friends. Florence was a remarkable, well, they both were remarkable people. Florence had been one of the founding editors of Fortune magazine and kind of a pioneer for women in journalism at that level and so forth. So made a very great impression on me. At the Arboretum, when I started working there and looking for the story, so to speak, I thought we should talk about restoration. And and at the time, this was in the late 70s, as Steve, as you all probably know, that wasn't on the agenda. And, but I thought about it anyway. And in 1981, Keith Wendt and I, Keith was the ranger there, launched the journal Ecological Restoration. And a few years later, organized a symposium on restoration ecology. And then at the end of the 80s, was one of the people involved in the creation of the Society for Ecological Restoration. So that's kind of my story.
Thank you so much, Bill. I appreciate that. We have two more introductions and we're running maybe 1 minute behind, so not too bad. I'm going to turn it over to Carolina. No, it's okay.
Hi, I'm Carolina Murcia. I live in Cali, Colombia. I am an independent consultant, and I see myself as somebody who bridges science, practice, and policy with my work. And thinking about the topic of this webinar, I thought about the idea of where we've been. And I would like to bring up a couple of people that are not in most people's radars because they lived a long time ago. One of them is the Emperor Dom Pedro II from the Emperor of Portugal and Brazil, that in the early 19th century realized how bad the situation was around Rio de Janeiro. And he wanted to do something about that. And he wasn't very successful, but excuse me, I'm getting my facts confused here. Dom Pedro was the grandson of the Emperor Dom João VI, who in early 19th century noticed this. The grandfather was not able to do much about that, but Dom Pedro was able to act on that. And about 50 years later, he ordered work done in an area called now the Tijuca Forest. The Tijuca Forest is about 10 times the size of New York Central Park. And it was restored with natives. Because this was done by foresters, it was not done with nucleation and trying to simulate too much the native ecosystems, but it was a first attempt to try to bring back the vegetation using native species. And about a century later, in early 20th century, Ricardo Cornuance Tarico from Spain, a Spanish forest engineer, was charged with reforesting 5,000 hectares of native vegetation in southern Spain, more specifically in the province of Murcia. And he did this with 5 native species, and he planted about 5,000 hectares in a matter of 12 years. By 1917, the area was declared a national park. So this is a couple of people as valuable and as heroic as a lot of the ones being mentioned here, but I thought because they were not in many people's radars, they should be mentioned here.
I think that was perfect, Carolina, and a good reminder that even though the name restoration ecology is new, the practice is not. Karen, we're going to give it to you to close it up.
I'm Karen
for the
Holl.
Introductions.
I'm Karen Holl, and I'm a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz in the United States, where I study how to restore forests in Latin America and grassland and forest ecosystems in California. And recently, I've also been spending a lot of time trying to improve the ecological and social outcomes of the massive tree planting campaigns. I've taught restoration ecology for 25 years and relatively recently wrote my primer of ecological restoration, I have a little plug in there, which is a sort of a succinct summary of the field from the work from my teaching. And I work with various conservation organizations to implement the restoration research that I do. And as such, as an academic who works in restoration, I really admire people who manage to span the science practice divide. And just one person who I think does that really well is my colleague, Pedro Brancaleon at the University of Sao Paulo, who has worked a lot with the Atlantic Forest Pact, the timber industry, government agencies, and NGOs to develop and apply innovative methods to scale up restoration of the Brazilian Atlantic forest. And I would say on the flip side, I work with a number of practitioners here in California and elsewhere that really work to apply science in their work. And I think it really needs to go, that dialogue needs to go both directions. Thanks.
That was wonderful, Karen, and a great plug for the issue of SER News that came out yesterday that is all about linking science and practice in ecological restoration. So those of you on this call who are SER members, that should be in your email box or check your spam or check your promotions. And you can read 4 really wonderful examples from around the world of the linking of science and practice. So thanks for that little plug, Karen. That was a great example. So we're going to move now into our discussion questions with our panelists. And we have 4 questions. We're really going to split into kind of the past and then the future. So we have 2 questions on the past and 2 on the future. And we've asked the panelists to talk with each other. And again, please use your Q&A button to submit questions, which will then be forwarded to me to also ask the panelists. So the first question we've asked the panelists to consider is, what is one of the greatest lessons you've learned about ecological restoration over the course of your career? And if you want, you can share a story about how you learned that lesson, but we're going to start with Carolina to share with us one or more of the big lessons she's learned in restoration.
Hey, thank you, Bethany. Well, when I came from, my training was on hardcore conservation. And I was working for a conservation organization that was focused on wildlands and wild places. So restoration was not really on the agenda there. But I was interested in that, and I started pushing the concept within this organization and within my guild. But of course, I was influenced by that environment, and my focus was to ensuring that ecosystems were restored to the best possible condition, specifically so that biodiversity, and coming from an extremely diverse tropical country, biodiversity was at the center of my attention. And so my focus was basically how to get ecosystems to go back to their original, their best manifestation possible. And, but eventually, as I started interacting with people from all over the world and different disciplines and people who were engaged in actually working with people, I began to realize that actually the ecological component of restoration was small. When you compare how much work needs to be done with people, how much people are basically a large part of the restoration process, from the generating the degradation to helping resolve this issue and ensuring that the restoration efforts and engaging in restoration and ensuring that restoration efforts are sustainable over time. So eventually I realized that the ecological component was a fairly small piece of the puzzle. And when I teach ecological restoration, I like to tell my students that if the whole process of restoring an ecosystem was comparable to a 24-hour period of time, you would actually plant the first tree or the first plant by about 11 p.m. because you would have to do a lot of previous work to try to work with people and address what are their basic needs that need to be met before you can actually start doing restoration. And only then, when you get everybody engaged and you really have addressed those issues, can you be certain that that those plants that you plant at 11 p.m. are going to make it. I'm not alone there. A lot of people have turned as long as I have, as much as I have, even more. But that was just my personal experience.
That's wonderful, Carolina. Thanks so much. Karen.
So I completely agree with Carolina about the importance of including stakeholders. I'm not sure we're planting the tree at 11 o'clock though, because I think that you might need about half the day to get ready, and then you need to plant the tree, and then you need to be following up with the stakeholders throughout. So I think it might be somewhere, there is a lot of pre, but there's also a lot of post too. So that would be my response to that. So another lesson that I learned was that restoration strategies really need to be tailored to the specific goals of the project and the socio-ecological systems rather than being one size fits all. We can definitely learn from each other, and it's really important to share results to see what works in different situations, but the results can really vary. And just as an example, in my own research, I have a long-term project studying tropical forest restoration in Costa Rica. And we replicated our project originally at 15 different sites in a relatively small area, across the region in southern Costa Rica. And even though we used the same treatments at every site, we had 3 treatments. We allowed the forest to recover naturally. We planted rows of native trees, or we planted sort of patches of trees. We were looking at this idea of planting islands of trees that then would catalyze recovery and spread over time. So there were certain things we could generalize, but we also found that the rate of recovery and the amount of biomass that we sequestered was like an order of magnitude different across all these sites in the same area. And I've seen really different outcomes depending on the year or location. And so it's really important for those of your students to do experiments at multiple sites, and also to not draw too general conclusions just from individual projects, and to really compare and synthesize what works. And when we see that something works at all of our sites, then we feel like we can generalize. And also another aspect related to that, which relates back to Carolina, is that even though it seems like our planting tree islands method is similarly effective to planting even more trees as a restoration strategy, and so ecologically, this approach makes a lot of sense. This we call it applied nucleation, putting nuclei of trees. From a social standpoint, it may not always be quite as appropriate, because if you have a small landholder, they may want trees of certain species that they're really interested in planted on their property. And so we really have to think about, which results are generalizable, and also really pick approaches that fit, the ecology and the landowners and the stakeholders involved, and tailor those strategies. Thanks.
Super helpful, Karen. Thank you so much. Stephen, do you have any comments to add to this question of what is one of the greatest lessons you've learned during your career?
I do. It's going to sound suspiciously like the first two answers, the importance of doing more than one thing at once. My example is what I think I've learned the most compellingly is the importance of the community, the importance of public support. And I would give as an example, a project we did, the Orland grassland. It was owned by a local conservation agency, 1,000 acres that had just been sitting there for decades. And we organized a program to restore high quality prairie and oak savanna on that site. A wonderful leader, Pat Hayes, as a volunteer, came in and took major responsibility for what the community was doing. She engaged the high schools, the neighbors. She got great media coverage. Very much in response to what she was doing, we got a $12 million grant from the Army Corps of Engineers through the local congressman for restoration. Now, $12 million is nothing to sneeze at, but she's gotten a bunch more of those since then that have made all the difference in the world. And I would say in parallel, the county forest preserve district here has, when I started, had no staff, no department, no budget for ecosystem restoration. And I think very much in response to volunteers and positive publicity, they now have a staff of 18 doing restoration. They've increased their annual budget for contractors from $0 to $5 million a year. And it's had a huge impact. The negative example to me is the Illinois Nature Preserves system, which was a world leader, as we saw it, 60 years ago when it was formed. And over the years, as original volunteers drifted away and it ended up being more a part of the bureaucracy, the number of preserves increased from less than 100 to now more than 600. The budget did not increase. In fact, it fell. Staff were lost. There were no director for 5 years. And it was because of lack of people caring, people understanding and caring. So we started recently, some wonderful group of people started Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves, and now that's turning around. But it's something that couldn't be turned around by the professionals alone. It really needed the community.
Thanks, Stephen. That's really helpful. I know, Tein, in our discussions, you talked a little bit about something that hasn't been raised yet. Do you want to share some points?
We were talking earlier about the balance between different scales of intervention. And I think that very often we go into restoration with a similar mindset to the one that caused degradation in the first place, and we see ourselves as the drivers of everything. Whereas in fact, I think with a bit more humility, we can be looking at the processes that occur in our ecosystems and try and assist those. So yes, I think a process where we work with natural processes can be much more effective in many cases than going in heavy-handed with an idea of imposing a complete ecosystem that we're rebuilding. At times that's really important, but we need to look first and see whether there are there's evidence of resilience on site and build that resilience, often for a lower cost and greater ecological outcome than going in and rebuilding. Thanks.
Thanks. One of the questions we have from the audience, I think Keith might want to say something too. I'm going to throw out a question from the audience, but there's a question, that kind of fits in this discussion here, which is, what's the best way to start in the field of restoration as a recent graduate? So there's all these lessons learned, but if you're just stepping in and you just graduated from school, how do you get started? How do some of my colleagues on this panel respond to that question, both from the academic and the practice side? We'll start with Karen.
Well, I get asked that a lot. I have a bunch of graduating seniors in my class this quarter. And my biggest advice is network, and get out and get your hands dirty and volunteer. And my students I see, they tend to volunteer, do internships. They get hired as the part-time people, seasonal, and then they go on, and then you hire from the seasonal to more permanent jobs. And so looking for opportunities to kind of meet people, let them see you working in the field. I think it's super important. Going to local conferences, meeting people, and kind of getting a sense of what is going on is really important. And I would say when people contact me for references for my students, it's partly about the academic training you have, and there are certain skills that are really helpful, like plan identification and GIS and wetland delineation and things like that. But a lot of it's about your work ethic and your experience in the field, and you're willing to, your ability to problem solve and things like that, just generic type of work skills that you need.
All right. Thanks, Karen. Anybody else want to respond to that? I think we are going to move to the next question, which follows really well on what we've been discussing. But does anybody else have any comments for recent grads?
I'll just chime in real quick and say that, first of all, as Karen iterated, get your hands dirty, go out, volunteer, join a restoration company that actually does the restoration, construction, or implementation, learn what it's like to actually implement restoration projects. That goes a long way in practice. So that's really important. And having a varied background, whether you get an undergrad in science and a graduate degree in engineering or vice versa, having that varied background that you can bring to either a firm or an organization or a government agency, I think is critical.
And I think it's a great example from what you talked about from your person you admired, someone who started as a chemist and then shifted to this field. And we have so many SER members who started in a different field and are so passionate about this work that they're like, this is what I want to do. I don't want to be an accountant anymore. I want to be a restorationist. So it's very possible. And then there's one other quick question before we move to the next one, which is, what advice would you give to those who can't afford to volunteer and do unpaid internships? Is there any recommendation you have for those who really can only enter the field if they're being paid to do this work?
Well, I would say that you should be paid. I mean, you should, if you're doing an internship, you should be paid. You shouldn't take an internship if you're not being paid. And so maybe that's a bit different than volunteering for a community group that's out there on a weekend. But from an internship standpoint, there are plenty of organizations and private firms out there that have paid internship programs.
Thanks, Keith.
Somebody else put it
Karen?
in that there are some entry level. The other thing is if you're working another type of job and you even just go out one day a week and volunteer a little bit and make connections, you do have to network in almost every field. The other thing I would say is that there are, my students will get seasonal jobs. It may be working in the nursery potting up plants, or, it may be out on the weed crew, or it may be out there. They're not, you would not necessarily things you think of as like really sexy jobs, or just even landscaping type jobs where people, there's opportunities out there, and it's demonstrating that you have the work ethic, you can think on your feet, you can work independently, and then you take every opportunity you can for any additional training or conferences and really reaching out to meet other people. A lot of jobs in the restoration field go through word of mouth, I can tell you. And so you want to, you need to get to know the people who are hiring, and the best way to do that is to get out there and talk to them.
I would just also mention that restoration restorationists need accountants, they need attorneys, they need all kinds of service providers to make that work happen. And so maybe you're not directly involved in the actual restoration activity, but if you've got those other skill sets that you can bring, they can certainly support restoration.
Grant writers too.
Finance, yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks, Keith and Karen. And Carolina has a comment, and then we do need to move to the next question. And I have some other audience questions that I'm going to incorporate into the next discussion as well. So Carolina?
Yeah, along the lines of what Keith is saying, I would say that also there are a lot of resources online where people can educate themselves into what is restoration, and perhaps by learning, perhaps they can't afford to leave their job for a lower paid position or whatever, but they can start reading a lot, and there are a lot of resources online. If you start with SCR's webpage, Biohabitats, etc., lots of resources where you can actually get some training, some basic fundamentals of concepts, so that you can actually, when you decide to make that move, you'll get some background work done.
Thanks, Carolina, very much. So moving on to the next question, we've asked the panelists to consider what they think are some of the most important milestones in the evolution of ecological restoration and why. And we're going to ask Bill Jordan to be the first one to respond to that question.
Okay. I guess to me, my answer to that question is pretty obvious, and I think I would describe it as the discovery of restoration. I've distinguished in my thinking about restoration and its history, and I think this probably applies to most things. There's a difference between just stumbling onto something and realizing what you've got, that it's something new. I remember reading a biography of Christopher Columbus years ago, and it hit him at some point after the first couple of voyages, I think, hey, that's a new world. Now, of course, there were millions of people living there, but for Europeans, it was something new. And, Columbus didn't know that. He thought it was China, I guess. I don't know. And I think that the discovery of something as being a new way of dealing land that has its own distinctive value took place during the years of our careers. All the people who were involved in this conversation, that they were involved in that process of discovery. In other words, the restoration had been invented in a fairly clear-cut, recognizable way about 100 years, about the beginning of the 20th century. You can find examples of this going on in botanical gardens and so forth scattered around, but nobody made anything of it as a distinctive way of managing or relating to the landscape or managing an ecosystem. And that took place during our careers, and we, in various ways, I think we all contributed to that. That makes sense?
Yes, I was writing notes because I'm supposed to do a wrap up at the end. So thank you very much, Phil. That was super helpful.
Can I
Tein,
just take
what
one
are your thoughts? Yeah, go right ahead, Karen.
Which is just, I agree that sort of maybe we in the Western world discovered restoration 100 years ago, but as sort of Carolina pointed out in who she honored, and I think a lot of indigenous cultures were involved in restorative activities long before that, and it's important to acknowledge that maybe it's just that we all of us, I'm going to say we as somebody who's in the United States kind of recognize that at that time period, but I think there have been a lot of land management that fell into the same category before that.
Well, burning prairies was invented by Native Americans, of course. Yeah, that's a major example. That's right at the front doorstep of restoration as we know it in North America. Sure.
Thanks, Karen. And this is a dynamic discussion, so you all are welcome to interrupt more. Tein, go ahead.
Thanks, Bethany. Yes, look, I'd agree with both Bill and Karen. The consciousness in our contemporary times of restoration is a big milestone, you know, waking up to the need, a paradigm that has been obviously known a long time earlier. But as far as milestones for the modern movement of ecological restoration, I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the sharing knowledge. You know, okay, once it's recognised, the sharing of knowledge between practitioners has been really a critical milestone, I think. And I believe that this started with Bill's initiatives to start the Restoration and Management Notes Journal. When you look at the history of that, it's clear that that triggered a great deal of activity, and it wasn't too long afterwards that SER as an organisation was born out of the interactions and collaboration of all those players. And their very first conferences were milestones that inspired many. And so for new people entering the industry, those things remain terribly important. The exchanges through journals, newsletters, conferences, and any sort of webinar or seminar, that's terribly important. And the milestones also included the improvements in education and training. Our curricula started to become more focused on what were the basic principles of ecological restoration. And that is currently evolving continuously, but and we certainly haven't really fully grasped the opportunities for training there in our industries and communities. But technically and philosophically, I think that the SER primer, or primer as you call it in North America, seems to be, to me, a big milestone, particularly its identification of the role of a reference ecosystem. And I know Andy Kluhl has been really instrumental in getting that concept across. So whether we're rebuilding ecosystems from scratch or regenerating ecosystems, that concept of reference ecosystem is really important. I don't mean, you know, an ecosystem against which we measure a real ecosystem, but a model that we're aiming for. So clear goals and objectives. So it's not about just any old assemblage will do. It's really about thinking hard. And this is even harder now that we've got climate change upon us. Thank you.
Good question.
I want to bring in that question. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
Well, just underline the point about climate change. What becomes of restoration in the face of global climate change? People have brought that up.
Exactly. So I want to bring two questions in, and Keith, you're next on the queue, but I want to throw two questions. Maybe you can decide if you want to answer one of these. So you know, Karen brought up this issue of Indigenous knowledge, and there's a question from the audience about the incorporation of Indigenous, or not about Indigenous knowledge. You brought up the issue that restoration's been practiced for millennia, right? And then there's a question from the audience about the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge, and if anyone on the panel has any experience incorporating or partnering with First Nations, Indigenous, Native communities. But there's also a number of questions related to climate change, which also just came up. So I think in the context of milestones, and Keith, because you were next on the queue, I don't know if you want to answer this or not, but do you have any thoughts on those two issues and milestones in the field in that context? And I'll open that up to everybody, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay. Yeah, I'll answer that. I'll answer both of those, I think, in a roundabout way here. You know, I think, first of all, it's being in the practice for 35 plus years, like many of us on this panel. Sometimes we don't even recognize that milestones are happening, right? Because it's all sort of this continuum of work that we're doing. And it takes something like this, I think, sometimes to sit back and think about that from a you know, a more sort of distanced, objective standpoint. Certainly the idea, I think, from my participation in SER as a board member and chair for about 12 years in the organization, the idea of traditional ecological knowledge and the role that traditional ecological knowledge can play in the practice of restoration really hit me hard in terms of, yes, of course, certainly we need to be doing that. We need to be doing that more so today than ever. And that sort of dovetails right into the issue of climate change and how are ecosystems going to adapt over time as climate's changing, as nutrient exchanges change, as our landscape is modified more and more, that we need to be thinking about how to adapt ecological restoration practice with that, and to think back on how indigenous people manage the landscape and some of the techniques they used and how they adapted those techniques to conditions, I think is a very valuable tool that we need to have in our toolbox and something that we need to use. I would say from a private practice standpoint, we're always striving to incorporate those kinds of ideas into the projects that we do, but because of time, budget, client preferences, regulations, it becomes really difficult. And so the more that we can initiate policies, initiate best practices, standard practices that incorporate both climate change adaptation and traditional ecological knowledge, the better off we're going to be.
And I'll just add, as not a panelist, but somebody working in the field, I'd like to also add my input, and I think I get to do that because I'm running the panel. So anyway, I think another milestone, and I think this is really important, and maybe Bill would have some response to this as well, but I think that when the field of restoration really was named and we started talking about the definition, there was repeated discussion that restoration is going back in time, and restoration is about going backwards and putting something back to what it was. And I think one of the milestones is really that with climate change, with reference ecosystems being developed, we've said it's not about going backwards. It's about putting restoration back on, putting an ecosystem back on its natural trajectory, and really being clear that restoration is learning from history and then moving forward to try to assist nature with being in a functional condition for the ecosystem that we're in now. And I think that's, even now I read articles that are published a year ago, this year, the year before, that say the Society for Restoration says that restoration is going backwards. We haven't said that for a really long time. And I think that was an important milestone in our evolution and in helping the field evolve. And I think it really plugs into both of these other comments that have come up here. Carolina.
Yes, I want to refer to another milestone, but this is of a different scale. And this is about the Aichi targets. Back in 2010, the meeting at the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, one of the Aichi targets was to restore 15% of the degraded lands in each country. And even though we haven't really achieved that, and we're very far from that, I think that this is a milestone because it actually put restoration in the political agenda and in the country's agenda. And the global realization at that political level that restoration was important for stemming the loss of biodiversity and for addressing issues like climate change. So I think that cannot be discounted.
Let me butt in
I think
there.
Go ahead. Yep, go right ahead.
Just very briefly, past and future and so forth, it seems to me I'd like to introduce the idea that the future of these, if we could say restoration is about the past, and the word basically does mean that, put something back the way it was. And people always say, well, no, what about the future and so forth? Well, we have to deal, how do I want to put this? Restoration in the fourth dimension of value, developed as a performing art, is a way of generating the values that underlie human behavior, and therefore will determine to a large extent the future of life on this planet. And restoration is a way of doing that with respect to nature as a given, not something that we made, but something we discovered there. And that's half of the human experience. The other half is what we create and invent and so forth. So it's important. Nature is given.
Thanks, Bill. And I wonder, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would also, and I just to link together a little bit what you and Carolina said, you know, you started the answer to this question by saying one of the milestones was when we discovered something that already existed. And maybe there's a level at which with the IHE targets and now with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, globally we're discovering that this tool is here. Even though it's been here for a really long time, for millennia, it's becoming discovered as something we really need to invest in. And maybe that's a segue for moving into the future. So I'm gonna go ahead and move us on to the next question, which is, what do you think can be accomplished in the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration? And by way of background, in 2019, the United Nations, led by a proposal from the country of El Salvador, and El Salvador made this proposal because in part they recognized that if they didn't have a functional ecosystem, they wouldn't have a functional country. They went to the United Nations and they said, we need a United Nations decade on ecosystem restoration. We need the whole world to invest in ecosystem restoration. And we learned about this and we were told it's going to take a year or two to get this passed. It's, you know, these things move really slowly. It doesn't happen quickly. And literally within 3 months, it passed in the General Assembly and was approved to be implemented from 2021 through 2030. And so we actually launched Make a Difference Week in conjunction with the formal launch of the UN Decade in June of last year. But we're now in the second year of the UN Decade, and it's creating that opportunity for some of the things that have already been raised today. And I'm going to ask Tein if you could start with your thoughts on what do you think can be accomplished in the UN Decade?
Look, it's a really big question, of course, because we're very accomplished at making promises and setting targets that we never keep. The urgency is enormous and we have to keep the momentum up. I think if we achieve nothing, we have to accomplish turning orders of magnitude more people onto the restoration mission. I understand that we've got to actually achieve the outcomes as well, and there are groups that are absolutely dedicated to that and they will continue to do it. But if we can't, you know, really attract the hearts and minds of people, just normal everyday people, changing our practices so that we reduce the processes of degradation as much as undertake restoration, we're going to be missing our opportunities. So we need to provide a hook of hope for broader action by individuals, organisations and governments. And restoration does provide this hook of hope, but making that link to people's lives is going to be really important. So yeah, we need to put our minds to that challenge, I believe.
Well, let me say that the idea of developing restoration as a performing art is crucial to that. And when we talk about traditional people doing restorative work, it was very commonly, and I think classic work has been done on this in Australia. It was festival. It was centered on festival behavior, activities that pertained to the human experience of nature and the human responsibility for it. It wasn't just science, you know, applied science. That's why I say my son once said when he was in second grade and he'd seen a movie about the Arboretum and he was telling me about it and he said, well, he was being polite, but he said, you know, it was really pretty boring, but just you could cut out a lot of that stuff, but just keep the prairie fire. That was his take when he was about 8 years old. And there's some wisdom in that.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind responding to that, Bethany. My husband and I are going for a holiday, a well-earned holiday in a couple of weeks. And the thing we really wanted to do was go to what's called the Festival of the Eels in Lake Bolac in Victoria, which is Victorian Australia, which is a festival combining a celebration of Indigenous culture and the recovery of that culture and ecosystem restoration. And it pivots around the eel harvest and the management of the riverine environment. And yeah, I totally agree, Bill. If there was more of this, I think we're going to raise a lot of interest. In fact, there are, as I mentioned before, many thousands of Australians and ordinary people everywhere undertaking restoration as a weekend activity. In fact, many people undertake restoration, go to their local bush care site in the way that their grandparents went to church. And that's terribly important. We can only continue to act as a steward or a carer for so long, and then we need a break from it. We need restoration to be nourishing in itself. So particularly now that just to be able to afford a roof over your head, you've got to work well into your normal retirement years, and then you're looking after the children, your grandchildren, because your own children can't afford a house unless they work forever. So, voluntary work is really difficult, but if it was more part of the culture and community activity and a nourishing personal activity, I think this is where we need to focus our attention. Yeah.
Thank you, Tein. Stephen.
Yeah, I deeply appreciate both Carolina and Tein talking about how this comes out of the culture. And for me, the decade of ecosystem restoration will depend on whether people care or not. And I think we have a moral and professional and religious and otherwise responsibility to help foster people caring. I remember when we started doing this work, we'd be along a bike trail and everybody who came by would say, "What you getting? What are you harvesting? What are you taking from nature?" Or they would say, "You're not messing this place up, are you?" And it wasn't too long before pretty much everyone coming along says, "Thank you for taking care of the ecosystem." They knew what it meant. And it wasn't long after that when President Carter put out an edict, whatever they're called, saying native species need to be used in restoring highways or whatever. It was becoming part of the culture, at least in a small way. And it seems to me that during the UN decade, we have to set inspiring goals and do inspiring projects and get them covered by David Attenborough kind of TV. So there's patriotism towards the planet and the biodiversity and health of the planet. And people are realizing that the planet requires good stewardship. The planet requires care to stay healthy. And to me, an especially inspiring another milestone, I suppose, yesterday, the Biden administration announced that Everglades Everglades restoration will get $1 billion of infrastructure funding. It's $1 billion of infrastructure funding. And that's because people are working on it. The case has been made, people have learned about it. And I think we just need to go from there to the planet.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, I would add one other aspect to this. So I am fully supportive of what everybody said. And I think, the cultural, spiritual, social aspects of ecological restoration, to see that be front and center in the next 10 years is imperative to ensuring that ecosystem restoration is part of who we are and what we do. I would also throw in there capitalism, right? So there's a lot of problems with the way we have our economic structure now, and capitalism certainly is one of the culprits of why we're in the situation that we're in. But I also think it can be a partial solution too, and to have ecological restoration be a program, an initiative that is part of society in terms of making money, part of capitalism, that people can go out and be supported, and livelihoods can be supported by ecological restoration, is critical, right? We can't do this with volunteers and interns and NGOs all the time. We need to embed this into our economic system. And I'm hopeful that, through this next decade, we can demonstrate that ecological restoration can be a thriving, robust business that provides livelihoods for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people across the globe.
Thanks, Keith. That's a great comment. And I think I'm going to wrap up this question. We have a number of questions from the audience, and I think I'm going to pull them into the next section. But I also want to wrap up and summarize a little bit of some of the comments here, because there was a lot of discussion about performance and festival and caring. And Tein, you also used the words, and you talked about kind of, it's like what people used to do going to church, although some people do still go to church. And I just want to bring in some of the words from Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who was a keynote speaker at our conference in 2021, who talks a lot, and others do too in the traditional knowledge world, about reciprocity. And I think that a lot of the terms that you all just used now, with patriotism to the planet and with nourishing and engaging in nourishing activities, is about reciprocity and understanding that when we give to the planet gives back to us. And that's part of that stewardship. And I think when we look at this question about the UN decade and, what is some of the opportunity here with the UN decade and what can be accomplished, and this idea of changing hearts and minds, that if we could create a culture of reciprocity towards the planet by 10 years from now, that would be extraordinary. But even if you start building it in small pockets, right, and then that grows, like Karen's applied nucleation, and we start getting that, growing and growing and growing, I think it gets to some of these points people are making. So I want to move us on to the last question we have, I'm going to pull. I have a handful of questions that we're going to pull into this one, but the last question is, what do you think are some of the issues that remain unresolved in the field of ecological restoration, and specifically, which are the most important to address now? And we're going to start with Karen on this one.
So I have three broad areas, a couple of which have already come up. I think the biggest challenge is that we need to reduce the drivers of ecosystem destruction in the first place, which sort of in a nutshell are overconsumption, population growth, and inequitable wealth distribution. And we just can't, we're living on a finite planet, and restoration can't be viewed as a simple solution. And I see a lot of this in these massive tree planting campaigns that people want to plant their way out of climate change. And I know it's challenging, it's the huge question out there, but we know, and those of us who've worked in restoration, that we're never going to totally be able to restore ecosystems. So we really need to be preserving ecosystems first. And that means that we really have to think about a pretty radical change in our lifestyles. Second of all, we need to really be practical solutions to scale up efforts. There's still a lot of small scale restoration, and that certainly has its place. But if we're going to, we need to think about, if we're going to meet the goals of the UN decade, we're going to have to think about what's going to be feasible ecologically, socially, and economically to scale up. And there was a question in the box about scaling up. And I think it means not taking any approaches off the table and really thinking creatively about examples. And one, I'll just give an example of a person I mentioned earlier, Pedro Brancaleon, some of the work I've been doing with him, where he's looking at working with the timber industry in Brazil to interplant eucalyptus, which are an Australian species, and then using them as interplanting them with native species and then logging out the eucalyptus to help fund restoration. And this is not something that, as a Californian, and I've seen the effects of eucalyptus, I thought, oh my gosh, why would you do that? But he's trying to look at a funding model that would work to help really scale up restoration, and has done a lot of monitoring of the effects. And so I think I could talk about some other examples, but we don't have the time, where I just think we have to be really creative and thinking about how we can meet the needs of people and the ecosystem in a way that's financially viable. And the third thing that I think we really need to do is we need more accountability. As Tein said, we set these targets out there and then we don't actually get there, or sometimes we don't even know if we're getting there because we aren't monitoring. And so I think we have to be really realistic. And this kind of gets at the climate change thing too, what are we aiming for? And I think it's really important for individual projects to make very clear objectives. We're not going to achieve everything in every project. What are your objectives? When are you going to measure them? And if you don't hit those objectives, what do you need to do to fix it and to adaptively manage? Because right now we're throwing out numbers, and in most cases, we aren't coming close to meeting them. And I'd rather see the numbers a little bit lower, but really have a target, 10 years, we're actually going to check whether we're there. So I could talk a lot longer, but in the interest of time, I will be quiet.
Thanks, Karen. Stephen, do you have thoughts on this question about what do you think are the remaining unresolved issues?
Well, I think I will boldly say that I think one of our challenges is to deal with what I don't know how else to say it, incompetence and fraud in the field. I hear from landowners who have hired restoration folks again and again with horror stories. Payment is according to time and materials around here, not according to whether there is success or not. And it's often hard to write contracts that cover all the details. It seems to me SER's efforts towards certification are a step in the right direction, but it can't be a rubber stamp kind of certification. It's interesting to me that lawyers and doctors and architects organizations see the need to sometimes discipline or withdraw certification from people that don't deserve it. And I think that sounds a little scary in a way, but I think it's something that our field has to think about.
Thanks, Stephen. Keith and I were actually talking about certification pretty recently. Keith, do you have any comments on that?
Oh no, I agree. It's interesting that an engineer needs a license to build a bridge, an architect needs a license to build a building, yet we're tinkering with ecosystems that are infinitely more complex and arguably would have much more of an impact on our well-being and our children and grandchildren's well-being. Yet, while we have the certification program, which is great, we're lacking behind on making sure that people that are practicing restoration on a large scale have the experience and knowledge to do that. And I'm not suggesting, I'm all for everybody going out and doing as much restoration as possible, but I think there needs to be some kind of system set up where when we are dealing in large scale landscapes, large scale restoration projects, that there is some of that, rigor behind that.
Keith and Steve, just one half a second here. Both of them mentioned the need for certification. I would say the strong parallel here is medicine.
Yeah,
because this is a form of medicine, really,
Yep.
healing art.
Yeah, very good point.
Right. Carolina, any thoughts?
Yes, I would like to follow up on Karen's list. Those are excellent points that point towards our better knowledge of how to do restoration. But then there is the other aspect of it, which is how do governments implement restoration at large scales? How do governments incorporate restoration into their government plans? And there is a major gap there between what we're doing here in the practice and science realm of restoration and the kind of information that governments, policymakers, investors need to have in order to actually get on the game. And one of that is that we need better quantification of costs, of how much does it cost to do restoration, but also what are the numbers of the benefits of restoration. So putting dollar signs or whatever currency sign you want to use into how much does it cost and what are the benefits of restoration. I think that's really important to put restoration into this sector of society, the way they speak, the language that they use. The other thing is we really need to provide better definitions of what does it mean to have restored the site? Because we're talking about now, we used to talk about a reference state or system, which was great. In our minds was perfectly clear. But for somebody who doesn't know what an ecosystem is, who doesn't understand about the spatial and temporal variation of ecosystems, what does it mean that an ecosystem were restored? I think we need to do a better job of conveying what we're meaning with that concept. And the third,
Carolina, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Can I interrupt you on that topic? There's a question on the table about what is the difference between the definition of ecosystem restoration and ecological restoration. So I wonder if you might want to comment on that, just in the context of your comment on definitions.
Okay, broadly.
And I can comment on it as well, and I can come back to it afterwards if needed.
Sure. Broadly, ecosystem restoration is focused on the restoration of the ecosystem. Ecological restoration has a broader approach, which is a broader vision, which is restoring the landscape, where there are many ecosystems, some which might be native, others might be transformed ecosystems, but that you might want to provide some restorative action to improve their quality of life of the people who use those ecosystems. So that's my perspective.
Okay, good. And I'll come back to it in a minute because I know you had a third point. So go ahead with your third point.
My third point is actually, I think we, along those lines, I mean, we're now acknowledging that there are many types of restorative actions, from basically just cleaning up a really trash site that was trashed by open pit mining or whatever, to restoring an ecosystem to the closest historical trajectory possible. But this is clear in our minds because we know the background, the ecological background of this, but for policymakers, this is really confusing. And because there is no one solution, and in a given landscape, many of these restorative actions may be needed. So I think we really need to be able to provide clearer guidelines on what those different restorative actions mean and where would be the right balance so that we can improve human well-being, but at the same time we invest enough in making sure that biodiversity doesn't get lost in the shuffle. So
that's great. Thank you, Carolina. And I'm going to just add on to your definition of ecosystem restoration, ecological there, where the UN SER defines ecological restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And the SER, if you look at the SER standards, has introduced, thanks to Tein and many other colleagues, but Tein especially, something called the restorative continuum, which articulates these different restorative actions that Carolina was just discussing. And the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration has defined ecosystem restoration as anything along the restorative continuum. And in the restorative continuum, ecological restoration is kind of reserved for those things that really move into the native recovery space. And ecosystem restoration then includes also things like agroecology and agroforestry and things where you may be restoring some structure and some function, but you might not be getting back to native ecosystems and things like that. So I would say that there's a little bit of ecological restoration almost being a subset of ecosystem restoration being broader, which is the opposite of what Carolina said. And we've found over the years that some people look at it one way and some people look at it the other. But I do think that the UN Decade is now trying to articulate a definition of ecosystem restoration that hasn't truly existed before. That's quite helpful. I don't know, Tein, if you want to add anything to that.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Bethany. Thank you.
I've learned from the master. That's all I can say.
I just think why it's so important that, as I said, is that we can argue about language a lot, and people are going to go out and they're going to use it how they're going to use it. And I think the most important thing is that each project make it really clear, what their primary goals are. And we can't have, there's always going to be some balance between human, ecological, different carbon sequestration needs, and really being clear about which is the first priority and then kind of balancing those. But I think being a little more honest about it, because a lot of times you have people just saying, okay, we're going to do everything in every project, and there are trade-offs.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's a question from the audience that I think gets at that. So there's a question about what are some methods, I mean, it's not the same, but I think it relates. What are some methods used to encourage more proactive restoration rather than reactive restoration? So kind of, and I'm not sure by what the person who wrote this meant, but I think a little bit of reactive restoration as mandatory restoration, right? You're destroying something here, so you have to restore something there. But how do we start to think about really encouraging, so I'm sorry if I'm putting words in the questioner's mouth, but how do we think about how we really encourage proactive restoration where we're actually moving that needle from we're in this kind of global phase of degradation to a global phase of restoration. I'm not sure if my hand is the right way for that, but that would be how I would think about proactive restoration. What are some methods for that? Does anybody have any response to that?
Make it a festival. Make it a festival.
All right, I got 3 people, so I'm going to go Tein, then Keith, then Bill. Tein.
Oh, well, what occurs to me, rather than method, but strategy. Many countries are working very hard to try and identify strategies for conservation and restoration based on real need for populations of species. Often in other countries, like in Australia, we've undertaken planning for development, and it's very difficult to retrofit our planning for conservation, but it's never too late. This is an imperative, I believe. Thank you.
Keith?
Yeah, I would just say that, I mean, for me, active restoration, that's one of the things that we've seen over the past 35 years that we're probably doing now. 80 to 90% of all our work is what we would consider, active pro-restoration versus mitigation, or restoration because of somebody having to mitigate some impacts. And I think really it comes down to, hey, we've got climate change, we've got overconsumption, we're depleting resources. Conservation should be practiced first and foremost, but that's not enough. We all know that. We all know that we've got to be practicing ecological restoration. We have to be restoring these degraded lands, and it needs to become embedded in policy, and it needs to be part of the GDP out there. It needs to be part of every country's initiative in terms of nature-based solutions in terms of their natural infrastructure. And so that's what I hope to see too in this decade of ecological restoration, that this is needed. It's not a luxury. It's something that we need to be doing, and we all need to take a proactive approach in it.
Thanks. Bill?
Just a brief comment. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but anthropologist Jean Anderson out in California has pointed out that anthropology knows of no society that has succeeded in achieving a sustainable relationship with its environment, which pretty much is any society that an anthropologist would be able to study without ritualizing it. And I'm just saying that that's the key to engaging people, is you turn it into a festival or some version of that. Some source of engagement, of entertainment and value creation. And that's the key to the future. And when my wife pointed out some years ago a scene in A Midsummer Night's Dream, we call it the climate change scene. And the gist of it is, it's in Act 2, Scene 1, I think. The Queen of the Fairies is arguing with the King of the Fairies, and she accuses him of interfering with the rituals the fairies perform in order to maintain the order of nature, as a result of which the climate is failing. Take a look at this passage. It's amazing. It's 30 lines of gorgeous Shakespearean iambic pentameter in which she describes climate change. And And the reason for it is the failure. And I think what that's reflecting is what Gene Anderson points out in his observation about traditional societies, ecologically successful societies. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Bill. I know we're almost out of time, right?
Just wanted to give you the 5-minute warning here. We have probably one more question and then we'll need to wrap things up.
Close it up.
I just wanted to quickly say there's a lively discussion in the chat about the importance of K through 12 education and restoration. And so I wanted to sort of promote that we need to be starting early and really engaging at all levels. So.
That's awesome. And Stephen, is your hand still up or is it old hand up?
That's an old hand. Sorry about that.
Okay. No problem. I mean, I want to just come back to one of the things Carolina said as well, because there's questions as well about scale. And I know that Carolina talked about scale, and I think somebody else did as well. But the last question I would take is there, does anybody have any comments on how we scale up? And just to, one thing that I'll say to kind of put this together is that Carolina talked about the Aichi targets as one of the things that started to move us into that proactive restoration space. And the Convention on Biological Diversity is now developing their Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the 2020 to 2030 plan that's 2 years behind. And I think there are going to be restoration targets in that as well. And I hope they're beyond the 15%, because Keith is absolutely right that conservation alone is not enough. We say that a lot here. But does anybody, Carolina or anyone else, have comments to this question of how do we scale up? And this will be the last question. Go ahead, Tein.
Yes, Bethany, look, I think scaling up area is always going to be a trade-off for quality. So we need to be clear that certain functionalities may be able to be traded. Biodiversity and persistence and a lot of qualitative elements of ecosystems will be lost if we trade up. But we need to scale up. But we need to scale up to achieve certain things like carbon sequestration. So, but in reality, I believe that scaling up, if we want to achieve the quality outcomes, we need to scale up the number of people involved and the number of projects rather than the size of each individual project. So maintain the quality, scale up the effort.
Excellent. That's a great response. Any last closing comments on scale before I wrap us up?
Yeah, I would also suggest that we have to be strategic in how we scale up, right? So, using the science of conservation biology, using the science of landscape ecology, thinking about food webs, thinking about large carnivores and wide-ranging species, and where will we have the most impact and effect? And to me, that it may be very local things that we do from a restoration standpoint, but those local things will scale up the impact tremendously.
Thank you so much. Carolina, did you have a last word you wanted to throw in there?
Yes, well, large-scale restoration needs money, and that comes from private investors and governments. The decade has it has a module on how to help countries develop their national restoration plans and move along with restoration agendas. The action plans for Latin America and the Caribbean has one major module for this decade on how to help countries develop their national restoration plans and how to get governments to understand the importance of investing in restoration. And also CBD is the Convention for Biological Diversity now is pushing an effort of training government officials on restoration and on how to do effective restoration plans. So I think there is hope there, but I think that we also need society to give these governments a push and actually demand of them that they actually move forward with that.
Thank you so much, Carolina. We're at the hour or at the half hour, so I'm going to close us in 1 minute if you can bear with me. I want to come back to the beginning where we asked that first question, and there was a lot of really commonality that we need people and science together. We need to involve communities in this process, and if we don't involve communities in this process, we're not going to succeed. And I think that was re-emphasized by this concept of ritual and performance, and that's one of the ways to really involve people and create the space for people to care about restoration. And that gets at scaling up, because we talked about the importance of scaling up this effort. Now we can scale it up with quality, but also, as Tein said, we need an order of magnitude more people involved so that people theme coming back yet again. We need to scale up the number of people. We need to engage them in a nourishing, ritual, maybe ritualized way. And then we need to do that in a way that is quality. And then interestingly, we close with this question of science and how to make sure that we're incorporating the science and linking science and practice together in developing plans that are high quality and make sense, and financing those and implementing those. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity here. I cannot thank our panelists enough for the great insights and input that you've provided. And there's no way I could summarize everything everybody said in 1 minute, but really, really fabulous input. And I will reiterate, there are many, many resources available. So follow up with Leaf Litter and Biohabitats, or follow up with SER if you have questions that weren't answered, and we can try to get back to you on some of those questions. And if you want to help scale quality and people and ritual all together, please consider participating in Make a Difference Week in June, and you can learn more about that at the SER website. Biohabitats, thank you for promoting the idea of this webinar. All of you who are here, all the panelists, thank you very, very much. And everybody who listened and submitted questions, thank you as well. Have a wonderful day, evening, or afternoon, whatever time it is where you are. All best.